So, of course, after the United Kingdom period of David and Solomon, we get the house divided, the divided kingdom era of Israel, where we have a division between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This is the period of divided kingdom, or the two kingdoms. And I've stuck here at the bottom, in terms of the near Assyrian Empire, Shalmaneser III, because in the British Museum, and here's my photo from the British Museum, I just love the name of this artifact. It's like something out of a fantasy novel or something. It's called The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Dun, dun, dun. You know, he was king of Assyria in the 9th century BC there. And this is particularly interesting because it features, the carvings on it feature what may be the earliest ancient depiction of a biblical figure, namely Jehu, king of Israel, from the 9th century BC. He's mentioned in 2 Kings 9 and 10, Jehu. And I'll give you a closer up picture of this. So here's the sort of panel here. This is a closer up of the panel. And here's an even closer up of the panel. Here's this kneeling figure who may well be Jehu, bowing before Shalmaneser here on the left. And we have the symbols, this winged symbol on the left, and this sort of star symbol on the right, maybe a Star of David, I'm not sure. But here's a translation into English of what's on the text that relates to this panel. And here's Shalmaneser saying, a tribute of Jehu, son of Omri. I received from him silver, gold, a gold bowl, a gold vase with a pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, a lot of gold, tin, and a staff for a king, and spears. So sort of listing the tribute that Jehu had given to him. There is Jehu here. Now, a little after that time, when Sargon II, king of Syria, died in 705, so into the 8th century now, died in 705 BC, various subject states tried to throw off their subservience to Assyria, and Hezekiah, king of Judah, stopped paying tribute and entered into a league with Egypt. In 703, King Sennacherib, who was Sargon's son, began campaigns to quash this opposition to Assyrian rule. And Hezekiah was expecting the Egyptians to come to his aid against the Assyrians, and they didn't. So here's Hezekiah, about 700 BC, Sennacherib in the Assyrian kingdom. We're having a clash here. This is Hezekiah, the time is of Isaiah, and so on. 2 Kings says, Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years, and rebelled against the king of Assyria, and didn't serve him. And here we have one of these seal impressions again. This is the seal of Hezekiah. It says on this seal, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. So here is Hezekiah's personal seal impression. And Hezekiah, to prepare for the upcoming battle, expected the Assyrians to lay siege to Jerusalem, and he redirected the water springs from outside Jerusalem to inside so that the invaders couldn't live off the water springs, and that they would have a source of water. And they had this construction of the famous Hezekiah's water tunnel with the 2 teams of diggers gradually digging towards each other and listening through the rock to try to find each other, managed to find each other astonishingly, digging through this rock. And you can still in Jerusalem today visit Hezekiah's tunnel and this inscription from the diggers describing the moment when they found each other and dug through the wall to meet up. Astonishing stuff. So in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And again, in the British Museum, we have this rather gory panel of the siege of Lachish. See archers here, people going up siege ramps, people being skewered on the ends of spears or poles. There's a bigger of that saying this is where that close-up was on that panel. We have a number of these panels, a whole sort of room full of these beaten panels showing the siege of Lachish, which was one of the chief cities of the Kingdom of Judah. It was captured in 701 BC by Sennacherib on his campaign. Now, then Isaiah 37 notifies us that Sennacherib gets this report that one Tirhaka, the king of Kush, was marching out to fight him, sort of taking opportunity that Sennacherib was fighting in Judah. The king of Kush starts kicking up a fuss, and when Sennacherib finds out about this, he sends messengers to Hezekiah in Jerusalem saying, say to Hezekiah, don't let the God that you depend on deceive you when he says Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Basically, I'm going to go off and deal with this Tirhaka chap, but I'll be back, you know, like the Terminator, I'll be back. And again, we didn't have any extra biblical reference to this King Tirhaka of Kush until we dug some up. And here from the British Museum, again, is King Tirhaka standing underneath the protection of this ram, which signifies his god, Amun, the god Amun, and Tirhaka, mentioned here in Isaiah. So that goes on, and it seems Sennacherib defeats Tirhaka, puts him back in line, and then comes back to finish the job. And Isaiah gives this message from God concerning the king of Assyria to Hezekiah. He says, the king of Assyria will not enter Jerusalem or shoot an arrow here. He'll not come before it with a shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way he came, he'll return. He will not enter the city. I will defend the city and save it for the sake of David, my servant. And then we have the story about the angel of the Lord went out and put to death, and the better translation here is some 5,180 men of the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib broke camp and withdrew, tail between his legs, as it were, returned to Nineveh and stayed there and never came back. Well, talking of Isaiah, this very recent discovery, this made by Eliot Nazar in her Jerusalem digs from 2018, a slightly squashed seal impression. You do have to reconstruct one letter of the inscription here, but if you do that, it seems very plausible, given also where it was found and the dating of the level that it was found at and the other things it was found with, that this is the sealing prophet of the prophet Isaiah. Just south of the Temple Mount, Eliot Nazar discovered this seal belonging to Isaiah prophet, or Navi prophet. The upper portion of the impression is missing and the left side is slightly damaged, but reconstructing a few Hebrew letters in the damaged area would make the impression read belonging to Isaiah the prophet, and that was found near the royal bakery institutions between the Mount and the city of David, with other things from that era and so on. Well, this, back to the British Museum, this so-called Sennacherib's prism in cuneiform writing you can see on here, and this gives the Assyrian side of the campaign. And this is very interesting because this is what the Sennacherib's prism says about this campaign. It says, as for Hezekiah the Judahite, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small towns in their area, which were without number, by levelling with battering rams, by bringing up siege engines, by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels, and breaches, I besieged and took them. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. I threw up earthworks against him. But no, this is earthworks besieging the city to keep people in, not earthworks against the city walls, right? Not ramps, siege ramps, or works against the city walls. He says, I threw up earthworks against him. The one coming out of the city gate, I turned back to his misery. His cities, which I had despoiled, going back to the earlier, I cut off from his land, and to various kings under him he gave them. But no mention of what actually happened to Jerusalem or to Hezekiah. Now, as we know, in the ancient world, people didn't tend to record their defeats. The purpose of this kind of recording is to big yourself up and say, you know, I took all of these cities and gave them to so-and-so, and I had lots of wealth, and I was really successful. But this sort of, I caged Hezekiah up in his royal city, turned people back to their misery, but not saying, you know, and like I did with Lachish, I put up siege ramps and I took the city and I cut off Hezekiah's head and paraded it around on a pole, whatever, is an interesting silence, and perhaps a significant one that ties in with the biblical account of what went on in those events. Here we have some of the archaeology of Lachish, for example, where we've dug up Lachish, and we have we can see the Assyrian assault ramp built against the walls of Lachish. There's the walls, here's the ramp going up to the walls in the British Museum. This photo I took of a stand that has various arrowheads and slingshot balls and things from the battle at Lachish between Sennacherib and the Judah. But we have none of that sort of archaeology from that era at Jerusalem. But we found it at Lachish. Also, it's interesting to note that the Greek historian Herodotus from the 5th century BC wrote about the destruction of Sennacherib's army at what he calls the entrance to Egypt. Again, look at the map and see that Judah is right smack between Assyria and that isthmus going out to Egypt. So the destruction of Sennacherib's army at the entrance to Egypt. Now, Herodotus says that a plague of field mice came out, obviously rather hungry, and they chewed all the Assyrians' leather bowstrings and quivers and shield straps. And that's why the army collapsed. But Herodotus attributes this destruction of the fighting effectiveness of Sennacherib's army to divine intervention. Now, of course, Herodotus is writing in the 5th century BC, but it's interesting to see that here we have, you know, a pagan Greek historian saying that yes, Sennacherib's army, its fighting effectiveness at least was destroyed in the right kind of area by divine intervention, and he has his own sort of story as to how that happened, although he's writing a lot later, several hundred years later. So what we can say is that extra biblical evidence shows that unlike Lachish, make the comparison between the two, Sennacherib didn't attack Jerusalem. There's no ramp or shooting of arrows against Jerusalem. Sennacherib therefore didn't take Jerusalem. The Assyrian army was suddenly rendered impotent without human intervention, and Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, and indeed he didn't return to finish the job as he had before. He'd already gone to defeat that King of Kush, saying, you know, I'll be back. And then he doesn't finish the job. It's kind of inexplicable. Well, the Bible has an explanation. And that does seem to tie in even with the account that we have from the Assyrian side of things.